Professor Elizabeth Mburu. Professor Mburu is the regional coordinator of Langham literature in Africa and also the author of the text that we'll be discussing today, African Hermeneutics, published by Langham Press in 2019. Professor Mburu, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Professor Mburu, how did you decide to begin writing on this field of African hermeneutics?
Well, I guess you could say the desire to begin writing this kind of book started when I was doing my doctoral studies, even though that was not the topic that I chose to use at that time. I was concerned about the fact that as an African student in a Western context, I was studying in North Carolina, I didn't have access to materials that I could relate to easily, for hermeneutics especially. And living in a Western context, I recognized that everything around me was geared for a Western audience. And so began, this question in my mind as to whether or not it's possible to have a hermeneutic that could address my context and that could help me engage with the text in a better way. Once I finished my doctoral studies and returned back to Kenya to teach here and to do ministry here, the need became even more pressing. As I was engaging with my students and teaching my students, it became clearer and clearer that there was a need to have a hermeneutics textbook that could help them relate to the text. Just like I had struggled, I realized that they were struggling as well. I was also looking at the context around me, and I realized that the context around me was very dichotomized. People like to say that Africa is a mile wide and an inch deep, and I don't like that saying. In some ways it is true, in others it's not, but in some ways it is. And I thought to myself, perhaps it's not our fault that we have shallow Christianity. Perhaps it's because we are using foreign methods of engaging with the text, and there could be a better way of engaging with the text that could help Africans relate what the Bible says to their everyday lives, so that we avoid this dichotomy that we were having. You find that Christians will be very engaged in the church, very engaged in ministry, and then during the week they're engaged in corruption or with witchcraft or with other syncretistic practices that just didn't add up and didn't make sense. Even students from theological institutions and pastors would be doing that. So this is what gave me that desire to begin to explore, what can we do? How can we be able to help the African church understand what the Bible is truly talking about, that Africans can begin to apply the truths of the Bible in their everyday lives. So that was really the impetus for me, my own personal experience, the experience of my students, and then looking at the context around me.
Professor Mburu, in your book, African Hermeneutics, you advocate what you call a contextualized hermeneutic. Would you be willing to explain for us what you mean by this?
Well, a contextualized hermeneutic would be the kind of hermeneutic that bridges the gap between the reader standing in an African context. In this case, I'm talking about an African contextualized hermeneutic, and the Bible. Like I had said before, there is the issue of dichotomy in Africa, the issue of living dichotomized lives. And so I thought that hermeneutic that understands the world of the reader, particularly with regards to the worldview of the reader, would be useful to entering into the text. Of course, we have very many good hermeneutical methods out there, but many of them do not necessarily engage the context of the reader. I would be thinking more of the traditional, more grammatical, historical, and biblical criticisms of earlier times. With the reader response, of course, they go further along in engaging the context of the reader. But that's not a hermeneutic that I thought would work for Africa. So what I mean by a contextualized hermeneutic is a hermeneutic that begins with the world of the reader, begins with the worldview of the reader, so that the reader engages their own worldview, examines their assumptions about life, about reality, sees how these measure up to biblical, contradict biblical truth, whatever the case may be, and then use that as a starting point. It's also a hermeneutic that believes that the literary methods and the literary techniques and the oral literature that we have in Africa is a useful tool. It's something that we know. So it's a hermeneutic of moving from the known into the unknown. And so literary categories like, riddles and proverbs and narrative that we understand in the African context form a very useful bridge. So that contextualized hermeneutic uses the techniques that we use for our own oral literature, given that, much of the New Testament in particular, which is the field that I'm in, was intended, even the Old was intended to be read orally, and so also began in an oral context. And so techniques that use orality are very useful in engaging with the Bible. And I think that's a subject of study right now all over the world, the issue of orality. And so what I thought would work is if I am able to help the readers see the text is not a foreign object as such. It's an object we can enter into. I like to use the expression entering into the text, because the text, it's like you become part of the Bible story, part of God's overall narrative. So we can enter into the text with techniques that we are familiar with, but we cannot enter into the text if we are using techniques, for instance, like deconstruction or structuralism. Those are already so foreign. So a contextualized hermeneutic will recognize that the worldview of the Bible is very similar to the worldview that we find in Africa. And so there's a very close point of connection. So if we examine ourselves and examine the worldview in which we live, and then use that and use the literary techniques that we use in our own oral literature, then we can engage in the text. And I developed a particular method for that, which we can talk about later.
Professor Mburu, what are some of the ways that the lived experience of growing up and studying in Africa, living in Africa, how does that shape the way that Africans do theology and philosophy?
It's a tough question, but I think that goes again back to the question of worldview. You will know from the conversation that we'll be having that I think that understanding our worldview is one of the most crucial factors in engaging with scripture and in living our lives here on the continent. If I think about myself, but nevertheless, even with modernization and globalization, I still say that I am an African in Western garb, because the worldview of my parents and the worldview of my grandparents has been, and passed on to me. I've picked it up unconsciously over the years, as have many Africans living in Africa today. And so there are certain aspects of theology, certain aspects of philosophy that we naturally just gravitate towards a view of certain aspects of theology and philosophy that is, I would say, typically African. So for instance, if we're thinking about ultimate reality, the conception of God, Africans believe God exists. It's an assumption that we have. We don't question it. A few modern Africans would, but deep down, if you really question them, they have a sense of the deep. And all Africans believed in the existence of a supreme being, whom, for lack of a better word, we'll call God in this context. And so that understanding that God exists, that assumption that God exists, is something that influences the way we do theology and the way we understand philosophical concepts. Because if God exists, then our lives must be ordered in relation to that God. The thing about this God, though, is not like the God that we see in the Bible. He would be very transcendent. And so we find that for many, many Africans, even in their lived out practical theology, so to speak, we have a very transactional relationship with God. We don't, if I do good, he'll bless me. If I do wrong, he'll, bring some kind of suffering on me. So it's a retribution theology kind of understanding. But this stems from understanding of who this supreme being is and how he relates to us. He is supreme, he is creator, and there are myths that would be told in many different African contexts that would help with that. It forms a very good bridge, I think, for us. Again, if I go back to the idea of a bridge, that we understand that God exists and that he is the creator, and that we are able to worship him But the other thing about living in an African context is, as we worship this ultimate reality, we do so in community, because the idea of community is key, it's paramount. It's fading a little bit now with globalization and modernization. Relationships are being formed in different ways, especially by young people. Of course, social media has brought about just a different way of relating to one another. But regardless, we still have this idea that when we worship in community is the ultimate. The whole worshiping as an individual doesn't really make sense to us. Other aspects of theology that I think would be affected by the fact that we live on this continent would be our understanding of the reality around us. Living in the West for a long time, I lived in the West for about 10 years, I realized that you don't talk about witchcraft, you don't talk about exorcisms in the circles in which we belonged, even if they were church circles and even if we were studying the same Bible. But for an African, the idea that the spiritual realm exists is not even questioned. It's another assumption, like the existence of God. And so when we go to church, if an exorcism is taking place, nobody is surprised by it. Nobody asks themselves, what's going on here? Because that's our reality. And the other reality that has come about because of that understanding of a very real spiritual dimension is, unfortunately, the belief in the power of witchcraft over people's lives. This is still something that is holding a lot of Africans captive, even in the cities. It's not just something that happens within a rural context. We are struggling as Bible teachers, as preachers, as pastors, to help people understand that even though that realm is a reality, Christ has overcome. And so there is no need to be held in bondage. But as you can see, even just by speaking to you, there are certain realities in my life that I take for granted. If, like I said, that idea of the spiritual realm being very real for each one of us, it manifests itself in different ways. We have an aspect of our worldview that we call dynamism, and the recognition that we're not in control of our world. And so in order to gain control of your world, you have to gain control of the spiritual entities that are out there. And so this is one reason why witchcraft is so prevalent, because the witch doctors claim that they can help you do that and then help you gain control of your world. So these are just some of the aspects that we find, more so with those who are more oriented towards traditional African worldview, but even amongst those of us that are more modernized. These are things that are, very, very real.
Professor Mburu, you speak about African hermeneutics as a four-legged stool. Would you be willing to explain this word picture for us, please? What do you mean by this?
Okay. I took the metaphor of a four-legged stool because a stool is a familiar object to all Africans, old and young. We all have stools in our homes. When we go to restaurants, we find stools there. When you go to the marketplace where tourists go shopping, you find stools there. So I knew that this was an object that would be familiar to my readers. But I also took that imagery of a stool because a stool is a very stable object. If you sit on it, particularly the four-legged, we have three-legged stools and we have four-legged stools. The three-legged stool in particular is very stable. And so when I was thinking about how do I explain this African hermeneutic in a way that would be understandable, that's the picture that came to mind. The familiarity of the object and the stability of the stool. And the stool has four legs and it has the seat. And so my hermeneutic begins with one of the legs, goes round and culminates in the seat. The first leg I call parallels to the African context. Those are parallels that you find between the African worldview in particular and the biblical worldview, but also other aspects, for instance, the African theology, or even things that happen within Africa that you find within the culture that are familiar in the text. And so what that first leg does is it creates that sense of connection. If you think about Paul and his Areopagus speech in Acts 17, used almost by everybody as a contextualization example, it's great because it does so many things. And when Paul is debating with the Stoics and the Epicureans, he begins from their world and he uses poetry from their world. He engages with their worldview in different ways. And for me, I thought, this is perfect. Why can't I do the same thing? So in this first leg, I ask my readers and I ask the people who are using the model, mainly students, I ask them, what is it in the text that evokes a sense of familiarity in you? So that again, as you enter into the text, you're not entering in blind. You're entering in recognizing that there are things that you already know about the text. So for instance, if I take the example of barrenness, so let's take for Samuel, Hannah. Hannah was barren, but when an African reads that text and sees Hannah was barren, we are immediately filled with a sense of shame because it's the honor-shame value system. Barrenness in Africa is still a shame, just as it was in the culture in which Hannah found herself. And so that sense of familiarity where we are immediately empathizing with her barren state and understanding what it means to be barren in a society in which barrenness is considered a curse. So that first leg then forms that bridge. And it can be different things. Barrenness is just one of the examples that works out really well. It could be an example that has to do with the spiritual realm. For instance, if you look at an exorcism in Mark, when you see this father bringing his child who has been tormented by this demon, immediately you understand because we see it. So that's the parallels to the African context. The second leg is an analysis of the theological context. One of the things that I did with this Fourlegged stool model is that I recognized that the West had some good things to offer with their hermeneutical methodologies. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I don't want to really reinvent the wheel. So why not pick out what works? So I incorporated, it's a very eclectic method. I incorporated aspects of a study of the theological, the historical, the literary context, as I'll explain in a little bit. So the second leg is an analysis of the theological context. When I was writing this book, somebody asked me, why do you start with that? Why don't you start with the historical context, like many Western models would? And I said to them, for an African, when you read the Bible, you're reading it to see how it can speak to you practically. You want to immediately apply it. And so if you listen to preachers, that's what they do. They pick up the text and they immediately apply it and skip interpretation altogether. So I thought, why not work with what they do, but give them a caution? And so we look at the theological context as the second step, recognizing that we are already beginning to apply the text. But I tell the readers in that model, be cautious. Let your application be tentative until you test it against the other steps that will help you verify the stability of your interpretation and your eventual application. So in that leg, we examine the theological context that forms the parameters within which we should understand the text. And in my book, I give the example of the Gospel of Mark, with Jesus being seen. Mark is unveiling Jesus' identity through that gospel as well as doing other things. Then as you understand what's happening in there, as you later come to the other legs, that theological context is already helping you recognize Jesus is the miracle working authoritative Son of God, for instance. And so that is going to guide you in that particular leg. You can use Bible dictionaries and so on and so forth to understand these. I don't expect my students to be experts and to be able to know that. Then, and then the other thing is that even as we look at our own African literature, the theological context is very important. Our stories are teaching us about God, about human beings, about reality around us. And so I know already the readers will be looking for that. Then the third leg, understanding of the literary context. With this third leg, what I really tried to do is to understand the various genres that are represented in the Bible and see what genres from the African context can help feed into understanding them. So if I take the example of narrative, as I look at the literary context, I'll identify the genre within the biblical text that I'm looking at, and then I'll use the methods used in analyzing African narrative to come to an understanding of the biblical narrative. Again, I say I would rather do that than use the techniques used to understand Shakespeare, because I think that the contexts are a lot closer. So again, it's that aspect of, I don't want to go all the way up into a foreign way and then come back down to my own way. Why don't I just cut right across? So the third leg is really it's understanding the language that is used. It's understanding the techniques of that particular genre and applying them to the text. It's also using the tried and true methods of analysis of syntax and grammar and the way it works, because I think that's very important in expressing ideas. So I think that would probably be the most eclectic step, incorporating all the principles of analysis of various kinds of texts. And then once you understand the literary context, including, the immediate and so on, the usual, what comes before, what comes after, the readers will begin to get a sense that the application is coming through more clearly. So the application that they had arrived at after step leg 1 and 2 is beginning to be more sharply formed. And so then you go to the final step, which is the historical context, the final leg. That, of course, is just a confirmation of everything and a sharpening of everything. One of the greatest weaknesses in analysis and in hermeneutics in an African context is that many of our students don't want to do the hard work of going into the historical context and understanding, for instance, what was the socio-political context surrounding Paul as he preached the gospel, because that will help us understand why he said what he said, for instance. Or the example I give my students is that Judas was expecting a political Messiah, and he was so disappointed because Jesus came as this suffering Messiah who made no sense whatsoever to him. And we have the same thing in our own context. We are looking for leaders that will deliver us politically, and then they disappoint us. And so we can kind of engage with what Judas was going through. Not that we excuse what he did, but we can somewhat relate to that. The final leg is a confirmation of everything that we've done as we've engaged with the parallels, as we've engaged with the theological context, as we've engaged with the literary context, and then now we come to the historical context. So now that helps us come to the seat. The seat is the application. It's kind of like the ultimate, because as in Africa, knowledge is meant to be applied. So we're not studying the text just so that we can speak in a clever way and preach in a clever way and show how much we know. This is supposed to matter in our lives. It's supposed to make a difference in our lives. And so having understood the text from those 4 aspects, one can now come to a good application of the text. Application, again, is a major problem that we have in Africa, mainly because of the habit of moving straight from text to application. But you see, once we've done all these steps, then the reader can say, I can see how this text would apply in my particular context, and not a context that is so removed from the context that they're reading about in the Bible. And of course, within the application, there's the idea that you must have your culture, trans-contextual truths, those that transcend culture, and then you must have those that are culture bound. Like in Leviticus, I'm not going to tell my students don't drink goat's milk or whatever. I mean, there might be some tribes in Africa that do that, or don't let a kid drink its mother's milk, or mix 2 kinds of fabric. I'm not going to tell them that, but sometimes Africans don't understand because the contexts are so similar. They think this is supposed to be pulled directly from the text and incorporated in our lives. If you read Exodus, thou shalt not murder, that's trans-contextual. We know we're not supposed to do that. If you read Leviticus, don't mix 2 kinds of fabric, then we know that's saying something different. It's probably talking about our relationship with a holy God. And so drawing the principles out of that and then applying them in the right way within the various African contexts. Because again, the African contexts are very diverse. It's not a monolithic group of people. And so we have to be very careful. What happens in Nigeria is not what happens in Kenya. And so how that would be applied would depend on that particular context. So that's the Fourlegged stool, and I had fun, working with that, I have to say.
That's fantastic. Professor Mburu, thank you very much for that very enlightening and very memorable way that we can begin to get our minds around this African hermeneutic and the way that African scholars are interpreting the scripture. If I may ask, African cultures have a long and rich history when it comes to crafting proverbs. How are African proverbs perhaps different than the biblical proverbs, and in what ways are they perhaps similar?
I hope you don't mind if I kind of switch that. I'd rather start with how they're similar, because there are so many ways in which they are similar. Proverbs, of course, come out of the experiences of a people. And just as in biblical times, when we read the Proverbs, you know that those came out of the experiences and that they shaped the worldview of the people, their culture, their theological beliefs of that particular community. That's the same thing with African proverbs. It's very interesting. I mean, young people use proverbs all the time. You hear proverbs being used on the news, you hear proverbs being used by politicians. I mean, it's just a fact of life. And we say the proverbs in our own languages, and we also translate them into English. So for me, the similarities come about in the way where proverbs have come from and what they are intended to do. As they shape the worldview, as they shape the culture and the theological beliefs of a community, they are meant to impact life. Proverbs have a very practical purpose. And so I see a lot of similarities in those two. We actually have some proverbs that are very similar. I can tell you one in Swahili. It says the creator is the one who gives life and he's the only one who can take it. And so that's a Swahili proverb that sounds very biblical. We have another one. I hit the head. This animal is not one of us. He comes from a strange place. Now, while that doesn't sound like a biblical proverb, it expresses the truth that people from different tribes were dehumanized in the way in which we regarded them, which is something that continues to affect us even as we go. Sometimes I think even the form of the biblical proverb, sometimes the patient one eats the ripe fruit and the patient one eats the rotten fruit. So it's a proverb that seems to be contrasting. And I think that in the Bible, we have such contrasting proverbs as well. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, answer a fool according to his folly. And so that contrast, the form of the proverbs as well, is very, very similar. And I think that for both, proverbs they're not promises, they're not commands, they just convey a general truth because they're based on observation of life. So in Africa as well. And so sometimes you find that Africans would want to hold on to their proverbs because they think that they're so similar to biblical proverbs that they do the same thing. I would say the major difference is that biblical proverbs have a monotheistic perspective. The emphasis is on the fear of the Lord as the beginning of all wisdom. It's about a divine gift of moral discernment. And so it's not just giving us wisdom to live our everyday lives as in Africa. It is God's wisdom to live our lives in the way that we are supposed to do. And so I really find that is probably the only difference that I would find between an African proverb and a biblical proverb. But I think African proverbs are still very useful because they direct us to God in the sense that if you are a believer, you recognize that this is a proverb that's based on wisdom, based on what we see all around us, and so there's truth to it. All truth is God's truth. So ultimately, you look back to the biblical text to guide you as to what the truth of that proverb was meant to convey. And so that's all I can say about that.
That's really marvelous. Professor Mburu, thank you so much for that comparison and that contrast. Could I also ask you about the parables of Jesus in this regard? So Jesus teaches in parables. How do African biblical scholars perhaps read the parables of Jesus differently from Western commentators?
That's a good question. I mean, Western commentators read the parables in very many different ways. I mean, there's so many books out there telling us this is how you ought to read the Proverbs, this is how you ought to read the Proverbs. And I think that African scholars have been influenced, and so they would have perhaps a very Western orientation based on the particular school of thought of what parables are supposed to do and how they function. So perhaps for this question, I can only speak really for myself. And so I think that for me, the parables, the aesthetic dimension is very important. I found that sometimes when you read, for instance, from a Western perspective, you're really reading it very analytically, trying to dissect what is the moral of this parable, and I think that we lose out so much when we do that. I talked about the fact that African oral literature, is rich in narratives and in poetry and so on and so forth. And so I would read the parables like I would read or listen to an African story. First of all, recognizing that they are not based on historical fact, which of course is, I think everybody would know that, and that they have a beauty to them. There is a way in which they unfold that is not just leading us to the end of it to find out what the lesson is. The whole parable is the lesson. And you have to, again, enter into it very holistically, very active. In Africa, listening is very active. You are asking questions as you listen. If it was being told orally, you would be responding as you listen, making those sounds of assent or, wondering what is going on in that story. Community listening as well is something that I think would happen quite a lot, particularly in a classroom setting. Would be reading these parables out loud and appreciating their beauty together. And then literary devices that are being used through the parables are going to help us understand what Jesus is trying to teach through his parable, right from the beginning to the end. And so I think that as you read it, is that recognizing that every aspect of that parable has a lesson to teach us, particularly when you think about, the characters, what's happening to the characters. And so I think that would be the way I would read, the parables in that way, just really as a rich, vibrant story that I can become a part of. Because again, the parables are meant to create an emotional response in the readers. And I think parables do that very well. And because we are used to reading like that, it becomes easier to experience what the characters are experiencing together with them, to hear them in their own voices as they speak, and to empathize with them, then come to whatever conclusion the parable is supposed to be teaching us.
Professor Mburu, thank you so much for that response. If I can ask you a question that we've been asking all of the interviewees on that program, and that is this: how can Christians pursue the unity for which Jesus prays in John 17?
That's a very nice question. It's a very good question. I will respond to that question from my perspective as an African believer and as an African scholar. I think that one of the things is the world needs to recognize that there is unity in diversity. Sometimes it feels as though people from different cultures are not felt to have as much to offer global Christianity as others do. Now, when you think about the way the church is today, Christians look like me. We are the majority. And if we do not learn to embrace people from different tribes, people from different cultures, people from different ethnicities, then we're never going to be able to achieve what we are talking about. If we learn to forgive the hurts that we have experienced, whether real or imagined, sometimes within the African context, there is the feeling that we have been oppressed, that we have been misunderstood, that we have been unfairly treated, and there is a backlash to that, whether in the books that we write or in the way in which we preach. And I think that it's important to recognize God made us all different. And with these differences that we have, with this diversity that we have, there is beauty. And if we can recognize that beauty in our diversity and recognize that every single one of us has something to bring to the table, then I believe we can achieve that unity. I guess it just goes back to the metaphor of the body. It's so difficult to achieve when you think about the global church. So for me is eliminate divisive attitudes and behavior, learn to embrace one another, and just hold on to the truths that Christ preached. I think that will do it. I know it sounds simplistic, but that I think is what would work. Not programs and not, more and more books about this and that and the other. I think it's just that change of heart, that transformation that says, I love you as a brother, I love you as a sister, I forgive you. And this is where we need to be as believers.
It's been our distinct pleasure today to be speaking with Professor Elizabeth Mburu, Regional Coordinator of Langham Literature in Africa and also author of the text that we've been discussing today, African Hermeneutics, available from Langham Press 2019. Professor Mburu, thank you so much for your time and your comments today.
Thank you.